Good morning. Here we are again. I wanted to continue with our poetry unit and talk a little bit more about the E. E. Cummings poem that we looked at last week. But first off, here's the way this one's going to work. It's going to work like the other two units. You're going to read some poetry. You're going to read in the textbook about how to look at poetry and how to approach it. And then you're going to write an essay in which you're going to analyze some poems of your choice. It's going to be the same as every other unit, just using poetry instead of drama or short stories. Um, my approach to teaching poetry is different, as you know for yourselves. Poetry is a very personal matter, and I really love poetry. In fact, there's a poem called "Little Gidding" by T.S. Eliot that saved my sanity at one point in my life. Maybe it saved my life. I don't know for sure, but I'm extremely close to poetry, and I love it. And so, for that reason, I'm wary about imposing my personal tastes upon you. I love some poems really deeply, and there's other kinds of poetry I don't care that much about. So I'm not going to make assignments for you, particular poems for you to read. Here's what you should do. Read the analytical chapters that tell you about the techniques and things, and then start reading some poetry in the textbook. And the more you read and work at a little bit, the deeper your understanding becomes, and eventually you'll find poems that you like, that speak to you, that you'll want to analyze. The best I can do for you is in this unit is not so much to tell you why I love particular poems, because that's personal, just as your approach is personal. But I can tell you how my feelings came about by examining the techniques and the construction of the way poetry is put together. My feelings are often deepened as a result of that. They're not often immediately the result of those kinds of things. My immediate response to a poem is the same as yours. I read it and I think, oh, that's beautiful, or oh, I don't like that, or whatever. And then if I find one that's really beautiful and I want to try to understand it, then what the scholar does in me is goes back and looks at some of the techniques and ways the thing is put together, and I can say, oh, I understand why it's beautiful. So I don't want to impose my feelings about poetry on you, but what I can do is show you how I got to feel the way I feel about poems that I love, in hopes that you can use the same techniques to understand and feel about the poems that you love. So I wanted to spend a little time with this little E. E. Cummings poem because I really do like it, but there are a number of techniques in here that are pretty simple to notice, and I'll point them out to you, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. So here we go. I thank you, God, for most this amazing day, for the leaping greenly spirits of trees, and the blue true dream of sky, and for everything which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes. That's the first stanza. If you pull it up, the copy that I gave you, and look at it along with me, that will be helpful. All right. There's a couple of things in that first stanza that I notice. We talked about the change of word case, like adjectives become adverbs or nouns become verbs and things like that. That's partially the poet trying to find a new way to say things, and it's also probably in greater part the poet needs to make a line that has some rhythm, not necessarily rhyme, but some rhythm to it. So as many of you pointed out in the forum last week, that first line would be written out if you wrote it out. I thank you, God, mostly for this amazing day. Or I mostly thank you, God, for this amazing day, or something like that. So mostly, the adverbial form would be the way that one would normally say that line in regular prose. Well, if you say it that way, I thank you, God, mostly for this amazing day, that doesn't work as a line of poetry. There's no rhythm to it. So Cummings changed the normal mostly to most, and you get, I thank you, God, for most this amazing day. You've got alliteration, most and amazing, the two M sounds. That's called alliteration. And that's one of the most common ways of creating rhythm in poetry. alliteration, alliteration. So most this amazing creates the rhythm. Most this amazing. I thank you, God, for most this amazing day. That's poetry. I thank you, God, mostly for this amazing day is not poetry. Then the next line, well, let's get down to the third line. A blue, true dream of sky. Well, that's just Cummings being clever and cute. The normal phrase would be true blue. You've probably heard it. So-and-so is true blue. That's the way we normally say it. So he just flips the words around just because he can. And he's just playing with it. That doesn't have any particular significance. That would work as poetry either way. So he's just flipping it just because he can. But there's another place, if you back up to the second line, for the leaping greenly spirits of trees. Well, okay, an adjective, the adjective green becomes the adverb greenly, which is the opposite of what he's done in the previous line. Mostly becomes most because he needs it to be that, to make a line of poetry. Green becomes greenly for another purpose. And if you think about it, the verb to leap and the adjective green, if you think about that, what does it mean to leap greenly? You can leap high, leap quickly, leap slowly, leap ecstatically. But what does it mean to leap greenly? It doesn't mean anything unless you know what he's doing. And what he's using there is a technique called synesthesia. There it is. There it is. There it is. Synesthesia is a psychological disease, among other things, but when you use it in poetry, it means to write poetry that has an appeal to more than one sense. Synesthesia. Anesthesia, when you have an operation and they give you anesthesia, an meaning no, thesia meaning feeling. So anesthesia meaning is no feelings. Synesthesia is putting feelings together. Syn put together, like synthesis or synthetic. Something that's synthetic is two or more compounds put together. So synesthesia, there it is one more time, is poetry. In poetry, is a line of poetry that appeals to more than one sense. So the verb to leap is movement. It's bodily, physical verb. Green is something you see. You describe something, this is a green book because I can see that it's green. So what he's doing there is he's using synesthesia to put the idea of bodily movement, motion, together with a visual sense. So you've got the physical and the visual combined in the two words leaping greenly. That's the only way that leaping greenly makes sense, because you can't leap, you can't say, oh, that was a green leap. That doesn't make any sense. So he uses the synesthesia to put the two kinds of feelings together because he's trying to capture as many feelings as he can. Then the fourth line of that stanza, another common technique, is a kind of a cumulative technique, if you notice, which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes. One of those build on each other. Natural morphs into infinite, which morphs into yes. So the way to read that line is, which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes. And the yes is where you land. So natural, infinite, yes. There's a progression of strength in the line, which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes. Bam. And so there's a cumulative effect, which is created by rhythm, and also the fact that there are three syllables natural, infinite, and then bam, the single syllable, yes. So all of that is the way that E. E. Cummings, the poet, creates feeling and emotion by putting different things together and creating rhythm. So the only difference between an uninitiated reader of poetry and an educated reader of poetry is you may both have the same response to the poetry, but the educated person knows why he or she feels that way. You can explain your feelings. You can say, I feel moved because the rhythm of the line moves me. And I would submit to you that that's a more profound and deeper understanding of a poem than someone who just reads it and says, oh, wasn't that pretty? Now let's go do something else. So the task of analyzing poetry forces us into ourselves deeply and forces us to look at why we feel the way we do, which I would submit to you would be an awfully good thing in the upcoming election to be looking at. All right, the rest of the poem is pretty self-explanatory. It is a sonnet. In form, it's a Shakespearean sonnet. I have it here. It's 14 lines, and it ends in what's called the couplet, which is 2 lines at the end. And in Shakespeare's sonnets, the last 2 lines are always what I call the zinger. That's where the message is. If you Google any of Shakespeare's sonnets and pull them up, you'll see the last 2 lines are where the message of the poem is. So, since Cummings was so careful to create 14 lines, I'm going to say, okay, he's modeling himself on Shakespeare, and these last 2 lines. Now the ears of my ears awake, and the eyes of my eyes are opened. That's the zinger. That's the main point of the poem. So you go back and you think, okay, what does it mean, the ears of my ears, the eyes of my eyes? Well, there are a number of ways of looking at that, but the way I look at it and understand it is the ears of my ears, meaning the ears inside my ears, or the deeper level of hearing things. And the eyes of my eyes, the eyes inside my eyes, the deeper level of seeing things. Because he's been very careful up at the top to connect movement and sight with Leaping Greenly. So the last 2 lines say to me, okay, the poem's about penetrating deeper into understanding, and ears of my ears and eyes of my eyes just means, to my feeling anyway, the way I understand this poem, the poem's about penetrating more deeply into understanding, even a mystical kind of penetration into the understanding of all life. And so the eyes of my eyes see things that my normal eyes don't see. The ears of my ears hear things that my normal ears don't hear. And those things are profound and important. So that's my interpretation of that poem. It's certainly not the only one. But what I wanted to demonstrate for you was I got to that understanding, which is pretty powerful for me. I got there by analyzing the poem and looking at how the pieces fit together. And the sheer pleasure that I take from this poem is increased 100-fold because I understand the poem. So again, as I've said, and I'll say it again, if you can analyze a poem and put it into a category, that's great, but that's not enough. You analyze and put poems into categories and look at the way they work and the nuts and bolts of them, because that's how you get to real deep penetration and understanding. So that's my spiel about I Thank You, God. You may have an entirely different interpretation, and your interpretation may be just as right and as beautiful as mine is. That's mine, and that's how I got to mine. This week, Again, I'm just going to invite you to talk in the forums about poems that you're finding valuable and good and useful, and why you find them so. But I'm going to focus a little bit on chapter, it's called The Art of Poetry. It starts on page 564. I don't know what chapter it is. One of the other things that poetry does is it deals a lot with sound. And so this chapter particularly talks about poetry that is derived in some way from art. But I also think poetry set to music adds something to it. So the poem and the music are beautiful in and of themselves. You put them together, they're more beautiful. So I'm going to give you an example to work with of another of my famous, my favorite poems. And we'll discuss that in the forums a little bit. So what you should be doing is getting ready to write your paper and knowing that you're going to need to apply the material of this unit, just like you did in short story and just like you did in drama. So it's fine to say, oh, this poem is so beautiful, but you have to go on and say why it's beautiful. What level of understanding does your education give you that's beyond the level of understanding of the casual reader? And it does give you a deeper penetration. And anybody who says it doesn't is just wrong. They're just too lazy to learn how to read poetry, I guess. I don't know what it is. But okay, that's it. I've gone on way too long. I'm going to get this thing out there for you and get some forums up. And I hope you all have a great Thanksgiving. And we'll be chatting as the week goes along. Bye.